The letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded inside a plain brown envelope that smelled faintly of tobacco and horse leather, and Vernon Redmond read the address written inside it 3 times before he finally understood that a woman named Pauline Sullivan was alone in the desert and nobody else was coming. It was the summer of 1882, the kind of summer that sat heavy and mean over the Arizona territory, baking the red earth into plates of cracked clay and turning the horizon into a shimmer of false water. Vernon had been working cattle drives out of Tucson for the better part of 3 years, sleeping under stars that burned like nails in a black sky, and earning enough to keep himself fed and his horse shod and not much more than that. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with hands that had been hardened by rope and iron and weather. He was not a man who said much, but he was a man who listened, and the world had a tendency to hand him problems that nobody else wanted to solve. The letter had not come directly to him. It had come to his employer, a cattle rancher named Gideon Marsh, who ran a spread about 40 miles east of Tucson and who had connections stretching in every direction like roots under dry ground. Gideon had called Vernon into the main house on a Sunday evening, which was unusual enough on its own, and he had set the letter on the table between them and said, very simply, that he had a favor to ask. The favor was this. Pauline Sullivan was the widow of Thomas Sullivan, who had been one of Gideon's oldest friends. Thomas had died 8 months ago of a fever that took him fast and hard, leaving behind a homestead 40 miles to the south, a small herd of cattle, a mule, a garden, and a wife who had not been raised on the frontier and did not entirely know how to survive it alone. Gideon had been sending money when he could, but money was not what was needed. What was needed was a pair of hands and a steady presence and someone who understood the land and the work. Gideon slid a smaller piece of paper across the table. It had an address on it, a crossroads, a description of a landmark, a distance from a water source. "I would go myself," Gideon said, "but I cannot leave the herd this time of year. And I trust you more than any other man I have working for me." Vernon had looked at the address for a long moment. He had not asked to be given a stranger's grief to manage, but he also understood that the world did not often wait around for the convenient moment. "What does she know about me coming?" he asked. "Nothing yet," Gideon said, "but she knows I would send someone if I could." Vernon left the next morning before the sun had properly risen, carrying supplies packed into his saddlebags and a bedroll tied behind the cantle. His horse was a solid bay gelding named Reed, 13 years old and still sound, steady on rocky ground in a way that younger horses were not. The road south was a pale scar through scrubland, and as Vernon rode he watched the land with the quiet attention that years of outdoor work had built into him. He noticed the dry wash that had been running a month ago and was cracked and pale now. He noticed the way the vegetation had thinned, the grasses shorter and brittle, the mesquite trees smaller than they should have been. It had been a dry year. Whatever this woman had been dealing with, the land had not been making it easier. He found the homestead in the early afternoon, and the first thing he saw was smoke. Not fire smoke, not the thick rolling darkness of something burning that should not be burning, but thin cooking smoke from a chimney, which meant she was alive and functional enough to have a fire going. The second thing he saw was the garden, which ran alongside the south wall of the house, and which was badly struggling. The plants were alive, but only just, the leaves showing the pale yellowing that came from too little water and too much heat. Someone had been trying to tend it, but something had gone wrong with the irrigation. The house itself was a low adobe structure with a covered porch across the front, well built in the way that men who knew the territory built things, designed to keep the inside cool and to shed the rare hard rains when they came. There was a stable to the left, small but solid, and a corral beside it. A mule stood in the corral, watching Vernon approach with the frank disinterest of mules everywhere. Vernon reined Reed in at the edge of the property and called out, because surprising a lone woman on a homestead was a fast way to get shot, and he had enough respect for his own life to avoid it. "Hello, the house," he called. "My name is Vernon Redmond. I ride for Gideon Marsh. He sent me to help if I can." There was a pause, a silence that stretched out long enough that he began to wonder if the smoke was simply banked coals and the place was empty. Then the door opened. Pauline Sullivan stepped onto the porch, and Vernon Redmond's breath did something complicated in his chest that he was not prepared for and could not immediately explain. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair pulled back from her face in a practical knot that had been doing its level best to come loose, and was mostly succeeding. She was wearing a plain work dress the color of old cream, and an apron that had seen serious use, and boots that were slightly too large for her feet, which he would later learn had belonged to her husband, and which she wore because they were the most durable pair on the property. Her face was flushed from the heat, and there was a smear of something flour, he thought, on her left cheekbone. Her eyes were dark brown, nearly black, and they looked at him with an expression that was caught exactly halfway between relief and wariness. She was not what he had imagined. He had not known what he had imagined, but it was not this. "Gideon sent you," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, ma'am," Vernon said. "Vernon Redmond. I've been working his cattle operation for 3 years. He told me once he'd send someone when he could," she said. She put her hand up against the porch post, not leaning on it exactly, but close enough that it seemed like it was keeping her upright. "I thought he might have forgotten." "He hadn't," Vernon said. "May I step down?" She looked at him another moment, and he understood the calculation happening behind those dark eyes. She was alone out here. He was a stranger. The fact that Gideon had sent him was reassurance but not absolute certainty. "Yes," she finally said. "Come in out of the heat, Mr. Redmond. I'll put some coffee on." He tied Reed to the porch rail and followed her inside, taking his hat off at the door. The interior of the house was clean and neat in a way that spoke to a woman's determined effort against difficult circumstances. There were small things everywhere that indicated the life that had been lived here. A man's coat hanging on a peg by the door that no one had taken down, a pair of reading spectacles on the windowsill, a photograph in a simple frame on the shelf above the fireplace. Thomas Sullivan, Vernon assumed, looking at the photograph without being obvious about it. A solid-looking man, older than Pauline by perhaps 10 years, with kind eyes and a square jaw. He sat down at the kitchen table while she worked at the stove, and he noticed the careful efficiency of her movements, the way she had learned to do what needed doing even when it was hard. She was not helpless, this woman. She was struggling, which was different. "Your irrigation looks like it's having trouble," he said. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "The main channel got blocked about 3 weeks ago. I've been carrying water from the well, but it's a long way and I can only carry so much in a day." She paused. "I know how to fix it, I think. I just can't do it alone. The blockage is too far down the channel and the ground has hardened around it. I need someone to break it up while I manage the flow. I can look at it today if you like," he said. She turned and looked at him properly then, and something in her expression shifted, some tight-held anxiety loosening just slightly. "That would be very helpful," she said. "The garden is almost past saving as it is." She poured the coffee and set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table. Up close, he could see the tiredness in her face, the kind that went deeper than a single bad night. This was weeks of tiredness, months of it, the specific exhaustion of someone carrying more than they had been built to carry alone. "How long have you been managing alone?" he asked. 8 months, she said. "Thomas died in October. The first winter wasn't so bad because Thomas had laid in supplies before he got sick. But spring came hard and the irrigation failed and the cattle need tending and she stopped." She pressed her lips together. "I'm not complaining, Mr. Redmond. I'm just explaining the situation." "I understand," he said. "And I'm not here to judge the situation. I'm here to help fix it." She looked at him for a moment as if she was deciding whether to believe that, and then she nodded and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and said, "Then I'm very glad Gideon finally sent you." They went out to look at the irrigation channel that afternoon, and it took Vernon about 40 minutes of work with a pick and shovel to clear the blockage and shore up the channel walls. Pauline stood at the head of the channel and directed the flow with a gate made from a board and some fitted stones, and when the water began running clean and steady down the channel toward the garden, she made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob but somewhere exactly between the two, and she covered her mouth with her hand and stood very still for a moment. "There it is," Vernon said, resting his hands on the shovel handle. "There it is," she agreed, and her voice was steady and practical, but her eyes were bright. He stayed. That was the part nobody had explicitly planned for, but that happened as naturally as weather. He had come with the understanding that this would be a job of some duration, not a single afternoon's work, and Gideon had told him he could stay as long as was needed. What was needed turned out to be considerable. Vernon set up a bedroll in the stable, which was clean enough and would do fine for summer nights. He was up before dawn each morning, and the work began immediately. The cattle needed attention. 3 of them were showing signs of a respiratory sickness that could spread through a small herd fast and devastating if left alone, and Vernon knew enough about cattle medicine to treat them with what they had on hand. The roof of the stable had a section that had been weakening and needed to be replanked before the summer storm season hit. There was fence to be mended. There was wood to be cut and stacked for the coming winter, which was months away but which would arrive on its own schedule regardless of how prepared a person was. Pauline worked beside him. That was what surprised him most, and what he found himself respecting more than almost anything else. She did not retreat to the house and leave the hard work to him. She was out in the heat every day, learning what she did not know and applying what she did. She could handle the mule better than Vernon could, it turned out, having developed a particular understanding of the animal's personality over the months of working with it. She was meticulous with the garden once the water was running properly, and within 2 weeks the plants had greened up and begun producing again. They talked while they worked. It started as practical conversation. What needed to be done, how to do it, what resources they had. But gradually it grew into something else. He learned that she had grown up in St. Louis, that her father had been a school teacher and her mother had run a boarding house, and that she had met Thomas Sullivan when he came east on business and had married him within 6 months and followed him back to the territory. She had not known what she was getting into exactly, but she had not regretted it, or at least not much, because Thomas had been a good man and had taught her everything she needed to know as fast as he could, and the frontier itself, for all its harshness, had given her something she had not known she was looking for. What was that? Vernon asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch in the cooling dark after supper, a habit they had fallen into without discussing it, the day's work done and the quietness of the territory settling around them like a blanket. Pauline thought about it. "Space," she finally said. "I grew up in a city. There are walls everywhere in a city and people and everybody knowing everybody else's business. Out here," she gestured out at the vast dark horizon, the stars thick and blazing overhead. "Out here you can breathe all the way to the bottom." He understood that. He had felt it himself, the first time he had crossed the Mississippi heading west, the way the land opened up and kept opening as if it would never stop. "You plan to stay?" he asked. "This is my land now," she said. "Thomas left it to me and I intend to keep it." A pause. "Whether or not I'm particularly well suited to it." "You're more suited to it than you think," he said. She looked at him sidelong, and in the starlight he could see the faint curve of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "You've only been here 2 weeks, Mr. Redmond. 2 weeks is enough to learn something about a person," he said. The smile deepened slightly, then disappeared as she looked back out at the dark. "And what have you learned?" "That you don't quit," he said. "That you figure things out. That you don't ask for help easily, but when you get it you use it properly." She was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like a very polite description of stubbornness." "It's the kind of stubbornness that keeps people alive out here," he said. "I've known men who quit with half your troubles and twice your advantages." She looked at him again, and this time the look held for a moment longer than it needed to, and something shifted in the air between them in a way that neither of them acknowledged but both of them felt. "Thank you, Mr. Redmond," she said quietly. "Vernon," he said, "if we're going to keep working side by side, the formality seems a bit much." She considered this. "Pauline," she said, and that was that. August arrived with its full fury, bringing temperatures that made the air itself seem to vibrate, and a stretch of days so dry that the sky cracked into white and offered nothing. Vernon found himself learning the rhythms of this particular stretch of land, where the shade fell longest, which animals came to the water source at which times, how the light changed through the day across the mountains to the west. He was a man who had lived in many places and always found himself taking root without intending to, and he could feel the roots going down here in a way that was different from anywhere else, though he could not have said, yet, whether it was the land specifically or whether it was the woman who lived on it. He thought about that question more than he admitted to himself. Pauline had a habit of humming while she cooked, small fragments of songs he sometimes recognized and sometimes did not, and the sound of it had become part of what he expected when he came in for meals. She read in the evenings when the light held old books she had carried from St. Louis, and occasionally she would read aloud from them on the porch, not for any particular reason, just because the words were worth hearing out loud. Her voice, when she read, was different from her working voice, softer, slower, like a river finding its depth. He caught himself listening for it even when he was working in the stable. One afternoon in the middle of August, a rider came in from the north, moving fast, and Vernon was at the corral gate before the man had fully pulled his horse up. The rider was young, maybe 19 or 20, with the look of someone who had been riding hard for hours. His name, he said, was Cass Whitmore, and he worked for a man named Denton Hale who ran a cattle operation about 20 miles to the north and who had a proposition for Pauline Sullivan about her land. Vernon kept his face neutral and listened while Cass Whitmore delivered the proposition, which boiled down to Denton Hale wanting to buy Pauline's southern grazing range for an amount that sounded decent enough until you thought about what that range was actually worth. "I'll tell her," Vernon said. "She'll send an answer when she's ready." Cass Whitmore looked at Vernon with the calculation of a young man trying to determine exactly what Vernon's position here was. "And you are?" "I work here," Vernon said pleasantly, and the way he said it did not invite further questions. Cass Whitmore left. Pauline had been in the garden and came around the corner of the house as the rider disappeared north. "Who was that?" Vernon told her, and she listened with her hands on her hips and her eyes narrowing the way they did when she was working through a problem. "I won't sell," she said. "Not to Denton Hale especially. Thomas never trusted him. Do you know why?" Thomas said he had a habit of offering fair prices for pieces of land until he'd assembled enough pieces to control the water sources, and then the prices stopped being fair. She looked north. "This land sits at the head of a water channel that serves 3 homesteads. If Hale owned our southern range, he would also own the upper part of that channel, and then the other homesteads would be at his mercy," Vernon said. "Yes," she said. "So no, we don't sell." He felt a small warm shift in his chest at the word "we," and he was careful not to let it show on his face, and he was equally careful not to examine it too closely. He sent a polite refusal back with a rider heading north a few days later, and for a while that was the end of it. What he had not anticipated was what Denton Hale would do in response. In the last week of August, Vernon woke before dawn to the sound of Reed moving nervously in the stable, and he was on his feet, and to the door fast enough to see 3 riders moving away from the property in the darkness, moving south. He checked the cattle and found 2 gates open that had been closed the night before. The herd had not spooked completely, but 6 animals were missing, wandered off into the dark. He did not wake Pauline until he had already saddled Reed and tracked the escaped cattle to a wash about 2 miles south, where they had settled because of a puddle of standing water left from a small night rain. It took him most of the morning to herd them back, and by the time he got them into the corral, Pauline was waiting at the gate with her arms crossed and an expression that was calm in the precise and controlled way of someone who is furious. "Those gates don't open themselves," she said. "No," he agreed. "Hale, probably, or someone working for him." Vernon dismounted and led Reed through the gate. It could have been random troublemakers, but the timing doesn't favor that. She was quiet for a moment, watching the cattle settle. "What do I do?" It was the first time she had asked him that in the weeks he had been here, and it cost her something, he could tell, to ask it. She was not a woman who liked admitting uncertainty. "You write to the sheriff in Tucson," he said. "You put down the dates and what happened as factually as you can. You build a record. Hale's not going to do anything dramatic if there's a paper trail pointing at him." He paused. "And you make sure your gates have locks on them from now on." "Can you make locks?" "I can," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she uncrossed her arms, and some of the fury in her posture softened into something that was still tense but was also, he thought, grateful. "All right," she said. "I'll write the letter. You make the locks." It was such a practical division of labor, such a perfectly sensible response to a difficult situation, that he found himself almost smiling at her back as she walked toward the house. September came, and with it the first hints of what would eventually become fall cooler nights, the light shifting its angle, a softness in the air for a few hours in the mornings before the heat built back up. The garden had recovered and was producing well now, beans and squash and tomatoes, and the late corn that Thomas had apparently always grown along the east fence. Pauline had learned to preserve what came in, filling jars in the kitchen with methodical care, building up the stores that would matter when winter came. Vernon had started making quiet improvements around the place, not grand overhauls, but the small practical things that made a homestead work better. The water barrel near the stable he elevated on a platform, so it drained by gravity to the stock trough. He repaired the covers on the root cellar so they sealed properly. He looked at the corral fence and identified the sections most likely to fail under pressure and reinforced them. Pauline noticed all of it. She said nothing directly, but he sometimes caught her running her hand along a newly fitted board or looking at a repaired hinge with an expression that was quiet and thoughtful. One evening she came to the stable while he was brushing Reed down, carrying a plate with supper on it because they had both worked late and had not eaten. She sat on the hay bale near the stable door and watched him work, and he could feel her watching in a way that was not uncomfortable, the way some watching felt, but was instead almost companionable. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said without stopping his work. "Why haven't you left?" she said. "You could have." The first week of work, maybe even the second, that was what needed doing urgently, but it's been nearly 2 months. Gideon can't be expecting you to stay this long. He considered his answer while he kept working. Reed turned his head slightly and regarded Vernon with one large dark eye which felt very nearly like judgment. "Gideon told me to stay as long as needed," he said. "I don't think the need has been satisfied yet." "That's not what I asked," she said. "I asked why you haven't left." He turned and looked at her then. She was sitting very straight, the plate balanced on her knee, and her eyes were direct and honest in the way they always were when she was asking something that mattered. "Because this is where I want to be," he said, and the simplicity of it surprised him even as he said it, because it was absolutely true and he had not quite admitted it to himself until this moment. She held his gaze for a moment, and something moved across her face, something complex and careful, and then she looked down at the plate. "I should tell you that I'm not," she stopped, started again. "I'm not sure what I am exactly at the moment. Thomas has been gone 8 months and I'm still," another pause, and she pressed her lips together. "I'm still sorting out who I am without being someone's wife. I was so young when I married him, and I came straight from my family to being his wife in this place, and I haven't been alone, not really, in years, except for these past 8 months, and those 8 months have been so difficult that I'm not sure they count as learning to be alone so much as learning to survive." "I understand," he said. I'm not saying. She looked up at him again, and the color in her face was high. I'm not trying to say I don't notice, Pauline, he said gently. You don't have to explain anything. I'm trying to be honest with you, she said with a kind of frustrated determination. I think you deserve honesty given everything. I appreciate it, he said, and I'm not asking you for anything. I meant exactly what I said. This is where I want to be. What that means going forward is its own business. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she said, You are an unusual man, Vernon Redmond. I've been told, he said, and she laughed, which he had learned to value more than almost anything else because she did not laugh easily, but when she did it was whole and real and lit up the particular space she occupied. October arrived and announced itself with a night of hard wind that rattled the windows and stripped leaves from the cottonwood trees along the dry creek bed. In the morning, everything was coated in a fine red dust, and the temperature had dropped enough to make breath visible before noon. They found one of the older cows had gotten into trouble in the night, caught in a tangle of old fence wire in the far corner of the lower pasture, and it took the better part of the morning to free her carefully without doing more damage. Pauline worked the wire with pliers while Vernon held the cow steady, and they were close together in the way work sometimes demanded, and when the last strand was freed and the cow moved off, shaken but intact, Pauline let out a breath and leaned back against Vernon without quite meaning to. He did not move away. She went still, aware of what she had done, and then she straightened up and took a step forward, but she looked back at him and he was looking at her with an expression that was steady and undemanding, but that held something she could not mistake. Sorry, she said, which was not entirely what she meant. You don't have to be, he said, which covered everything. They walked back to the house without talking about it, but something had changed, slightly and irrevocably, the way the angle of light changed in October. Too subtle to catch the exact moment it happened, but obvious enough when you stopped to notice. The first real frost came in late October, and with it a settled quiet over the land that Vernon had learned to read as the territory's version of peace. Not absence but stillness. The herd settled and healthy, the stores adequate, the structures sound, the land going into its winter mode of low and patient endurance. On a Sunday afternoon when the work was caught up enough to allow it, Pauline brought out the reading books and they sat together on the porch with blankets across their laps, which was a new habit, the air being too cold now for just shirt sleeves in the evenings. She read aloud and he listened, and at some point in the reading their shoulders were touching, not dramatically, just the ordinary proximity of two people sharing a small space, but neither of them moved away. When she finished the chapter she was reading, she closed the book and did not immediately say anything. My brother wrote last week, she said finally. He wants me to come back to St. Louis. Vernon felt something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. What did you say? I haven't answered yet, she said. She looked out at the land, the familiar sweep of it, the mountains going purple in the late light. He means well. He thinks I'm wasting myself out here. What do you think? Vernon asked. She was quiet for a moment. I think this is my home, she said. And I think he doesn't quite understand what that means because he grew up in a city and the city is still his home and he can't imagine choosing otherwise. A pause. And I think that 8 months ago I might have been tempted by the offer, but now she stopped. Now, he said carefully. Now it doesn't seem like something I want, she said. She did not look at him when she said it, but he understood from the careful neutrality of her voice exactly what she meant. He looked at the side of her face, at the line of her jaw and the way the cold had put color in her cheeks, and he thought about all the days of this place and all the evenings on this porch and all the mornings of work side by side, and he said quietly, I'm glad to hear that. She turned her head and looked at him. They were very close. The way sitting together under shared blankets on a cold porch made people close. He could see the individual dark lashes framing her eyes and the small scar at the corner of her chin she had gotten, she had once told him, from falling off a fence at age 10. Vernon, she said. Her voice was different, lower, uncertain in a way that was not her usual uncertainty. Not the uncertainty of a woman who did not know how to do something, but the uncertainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was moving toward and was making sure she meant to move there. "Yes," he said. "I don't want you to leave," she said. "I'm not saying it because of the work, though the work is real. I'm saying it because," she looked at him steadily, "because the world is different when you are in it, and I don't think I'm ready to go back to the other version." He reached out and took her hand, which was resting on her knee, and he held it in both of his, and he said, "I'm not going anywhere." She looked down at their hands and then back up at his face, and then she leaned forward and kissed him once briefly, warmly, and sat back. "All right," she said, as if something had been decided, as if a problem had been solved. There was something endearing about the practicality of it, and he found himself smiling in a way he could not stop. "All right," he agreed. They sat on the porch until the cold drove them inside, and that evening at supper, there was a quality to the air between them that was new and quiet, and felt like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something uncertain. November brought its own business. A rider came out from Tucson with a letter from the county sheriff acknowledging Pauline's report about the gate incidents, and noting that several complaints about Denton Hale's business practices had been received, and that the matter was under investigation. This was not resolution, but it was movement, and Pauline read the letter twice and then filed it in the tin box where she kept important papers and said, with satisfaction, Thomas was right about him. It also brought a visit from Gideon Marsh, who rode down on a Friday and stayed for supper, and seemed to take in the situation of the homestead and of Vernon and Pauline with the calm acceptance of a man who had hoped things would go this way, but had been too careful to say so. He and Vernon walked out to look at the herd after supper, and Gideon said, without looking at him, "You look like a man who has found his footing." "Something like that," Vernon said. "She's a good woman," Gideon said. "Thomas thought the world of her. He worried about leaving her at the end. He made me promise to look after her." Vernon looked at the cattle in the dim light, the herd healthy and solid. "You did," he said. "You did," Gideon said. "I just arranged it." Inside, Pauline was washing up the supper dishes, and through the window her lamp cast a warm square of gold light into the cold dark outside, and Vernon looked at it and thought about how a man could go most of his life without a place that was truly his, and then find it in the most unexpected coordinates on the map. "You're not planning to leave, are you?" Gideon said. "No," Vernon said. Gideon nodded once, as if this confirmed something he already knew, and they went back inside. Gideon left in the morning with the satisfied air of a man who had honored a promise, and the homestead settled back into its quiet rhythms. Winter came properly in December, which in the Arizona territory meant cold nights that dropped below freezing and days that were clear and brilliant and cold enough to keep your breath visible until noon. The work shifted more time inside, mending things, preparing things, the slower and more interior work of waiting out the cold season. Vernon had by now moved his bedroll from the stable into the house proper, into the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage, and which Pauline had cleared out and made into something that could reasonably be called a room. It was modest and it was proper. They had not moved faster than either of them was ready to move, but it put them in the same house instead of separated by a stable wall, and that itself felt like a declaration of something. They were careful with each other during this period, not distant careful. There was a difference. Pauline needed time, and he understood that and did not push. But the evenings together were warm and real, talking by the fire after supper, her reading or writing letters, him working on something that needed fixing, Reed's gentle movements audible from the stable, small domestic sounds that accumulated into something that felt like life being properly lived. One evening in December, she was writing a letter to her brother in St. Louis, and Vernon was mending a piece of harness, and she looked up from the letter and said, "I told him I'm not coming back." Vernon looked up. "I told him I have a home here," she said, "and that I'm doing well." She paused. "I told him about you." "What did you tell him?" she considered her phrasing. That Gideon sent a man to help and that the man had stayed and that I hoped he would continue to stay. Is that what you want? He asked. She put her pen down and turned in her chair to face him properly. I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly, even if it is not the answer you think I want to hear. All right, he said. Are you staying because this is where you want to be? She said. Or are you staying because you feel an obligation to Gideon, or because you feel sorry for me, or because there is no better option presenting itself? He put the harness down. He met her gaze squarely. I am staying because when I think about leaving, I feel a particular kind of loss that I have not felt about a place since I was 19 years old. And because you are the most honest and capable and remarkable person I have had the good fortune to know. And because every morning I wake up glad to be in this specific house, doing this specific work, alongside this specific woman. She looked at him for a long moment, and her expression was entirely readable, entirely open in a way she did not usually let it be, transparent with feeling, with something bright and careful and hopeful. Then I am glad you stayed, she said, and I hope you keep waking up that way. I intend to, he said. Christmas in 1882 on the Arizona frontier was a quiet affair. There was no church within riding distance, and the winter made travel difficult. But Pauline had a tradition from before that she kept up. She cooked a proper Christmas meal, using preserved stores and the smoked ham they had put up in November, and she set the table with care, and made the house as fine as it could be made, with a sprig of pine on the shelf beside Thomas's photograph and candles in the windows. Vernon came in from the morning chores and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of it, and then at her, flushed from cooking in her good dress, the one she saved for occasions, blue wool with white trim. "Merry Christmas," she said. He had never felt the holiday as anything much, moving from place to place as he had. He felt it now. They ate together and talked and laughed more than they usually laughed, and after supper Vernon produced a small package wrapped in cloth that he had been hiding in his room since the last time he had been into Tucson for supplies. Inside was a book, a good one, a collection of poetry and literature he had found in a used bookshop in town, knowing she loved to read. She held it in both hands and ran her thumb over the cover and looked up at him with an expression that made him feel he had done something right. "I didn't know you were," she started. "I saved up some," he said. It seemed right. She had made him something too, a new pair of work gloves, stitched carefully and clearly taking considerable effort, and lined with wool that would make the winter chores significantly less brutal on his hands. "You didn't have to," he said. "I wanted to," she said simply. They sat by the fire that evening, the new book open across her lap, his new gloves resting on the table nearby, and the wind outside went about its indifferent business, while inside there was warmth and light, and two people who had arrived at something together that had not been planned or sought, but had grown up between them as naturally and necessarily as everything else that grew in difficult soil. January was the hardest month. The cold deepened and one of the cattle died, not from sickness but from age. An old cow who had been Thomas's from the beginning and who gave out in the night, and was simply gone in the morning when Vernon went to check on the herd. Pauline took the news with a kind of steady sorrow that told him the animal had meant something to her as part of the life she had built here. They buried what they could and Pauline stood by it a moment in the cold and said, quietly, "She was here when I first came. She was the first animal Thomas introduced me to. He said she was the nicest-tempered cow he'd ever owned." "She was," Vernon agreed. He had worked with the animal for months now, and it was true. Pauline turned back toward the house and Vernon walked beside her, and she reached out without looking at him and took his arm, her hand in the crook of his elbow, and they walked back that way, close against the cold. February brought a thaw, and the ice at the water source broke up and began running, and with it came the first signs that the land was not as finished with winter as they might have hoped, because the thaw also softened the channel banks, and two sections gave way, and the irrigation failed again. Not as badly as it had in the summer, but enough to require immediate attention. This time Pauline knew what to do as well as Vernon did, and they worked the repair together as a team, her knowledge of this specific channel now equal to his, and the work was done in half the time it would have taken either of them alone. Afterward, leaning on their tools in the pale winter sun, Pauline said, "I've been thinking." "About," he said. "About the land and what it needs to be properly sustainable," she said. "The herd is too small for the grazing range. We could expand it by spring if we bought some stock, and the garden could be larger if we diverted the secondary channel. And I've been thinking about whether we could plant some of the north field, which Thomas never cultivated, with grain that could feed the stock through winter." She had been thinking about all of this clearly and practically, and Vernon listened to all of it, and when she was done he said, "All of that is possible. Most of it I can do. The grain planting would need to be planned properly for the season." "I know," she said. "I've been reading about it." He looked at her. She had been reading about farming practices in the territory, because this was her land and her life, and she was building it in the most informed way she knew how. "Pauline," he said. She looked at him. "I would like to help you build this," he said. "All of it, formally." He paused. He had been thinking about how to say this for several weeks, finding and discarding different approaches, and ultimately deciding that the most honest approach was also the simplest one. "I would like to ask if you would consider marrying me. Not because you need help, and not because Gideon sent me, but because I am a better man on this land with you than I have been anywhere else in my life, and because I think we are well suited in ways that matter more than I can fully put into words, and because I love you." The word came out simply and correctly, and he did not take it back or qualify it. She looked at him for a long moment, this woman who had survived so much and built so much and learned so much in the 2 years since her world had been remade without her permission, and her eyes were very bright. "I thought about it a great deal before you asked," she said. "I wanted to be sure." "Are you?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you too, Vernon, and yes, I will marry you." He smiled at her and she smiled back, and then she laughed, that whole and real laugh that had become one of his favorite sounds in the world, and she stepped forward and hugged him, both arms around him and her face against his shoulder, and he held her, and the winter sun was pale but real, and the land stretched out around them in every direction, patient and large in theirs. They were married in March of 1883 in Tucson, at a simple church ceremony, attended by Gideon Marsh and his wife Clara, who wept with uncomplicated happiness throughout the proceedings, and by a handful of other people from the surrounding area who had come to know Pauline over the past year, and who had opinions about Vernon that were generally favorable once they understood who he was and what he had done. The ceremony was short, and the words were sincere, and Pauline wore the blue wool dress with white trim that she had worn at Christmas, and put a white flower in her hair that Clara had brought from her own garden, and Vernon wore a clean shirt and his best coat and hat, and felt as suited to this moment as he had felt to almost any other in his life. When it was done they rode home together, Pauline on the mule and Vernon on Reed, side by side on the road south as the afternoon light went long and golden over the desert, the mountains in the distance going all their colors, and the whole territory seemingly in a good mood about the thing that had just happened. "Well," Pauline said after a mile of comfortable silence. "Well," Vernon said. "We're married," she said, as if confirming it. "We are," he said. "That's a significant thing," she said. "It is," he agreed. She looked at him sidelong with a smile he was already intimately familiar with. "Are you happy?" "I am," he said. "Profoundly so. Are you?" "Yes," she said simply, and looked back at the road ahead, and the word had the quality of something fully meant. Spring on the homestead was a revelation. Vernon had seen springs everywhere from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, and he had never quite seen one like this, because he had never before had a stake in the outcome. The garden was planted larger and earlier, the second channel diversion working exactly as Pauline had planned it, and the north field was cleared and planted with oats and barley that would be cut for hay in late summer and stored for winter feed. The expanded herd, 8 new animals bought at market in Tucson, grazed the South Range with the confident ease of cattle who had found good grass. They worked every day, still, hard and consistent as always, but there was something different about it now. It was not work to survive. It was work to build. There was a future attached to the effort, a future with shape and dimension, and the difference between the two kinds of work was everything. The matter of Denton Hale resolved itself in April, not dramatically but definitively. The county sheriff, following up on several complaints including Pauline's carefully documented reports, determined that Hale had been systematically pressuring small landholders throughout the territory using tactics that bordered on legal, but crossed the line often enough to constitute a pattern of misconduct. Hale's operations were restricted, several of his key land claims were challenged, and a quiet understanding was reached that kept his attention away from the Sullivan Redmond property permanently. When Pauline got the letter about it, she read it through twice, folded it neatly and put it in the tin box, and then she sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a moment. Thomas would have been pleased, she said. He would have, Vernon agreed. He would have liked you, she said. I think about that sometimes. He was a good judge of character. She paused. He would have trusted you, Vernon nodded. He understood what she was saying. She was not comparing them or making one smaller to make room for the other. She was weaving Vernon into the fabric of this place, connecting him to its history the way you connect a new piece of fence to existing posts. He was grateful for it. I hope I would have earned it, he said. I know you would have, she said. Summer came back again, the second summer Vernon had spent on this land, and it was a different summer from the first in ways he noticed constantly. He knew the land now as well as he had known any land in his life. He knew where the water lay and where the ground dried fastest, and which fence sections needed attention before the monsoon season, and how the cattle moved in the heat. He knew the house, every creak of it, every draft, every corner where the morning light fell longest. More than anything, he knew Pauline. The specific architecture of how her mind worked, methodical and curious and occasionally stubborn in ways that were actually creative solutions to problems she had not stated openly yet. The particular quality of her silences, which were numerous and which he had learned to read like weather, a thinking silence, a sad silence, a content silence, a silence that meant she had something to say but was waiting for the right moment. The way she moved through the house, and the land with a kind of ownership that was not arrogance but deep belonging, the way a tree belongs to its specific soil. He loved all of it. He loved her constantly and specifically, not in the abstract the way he had imagined love might be before he understood it, but in every particular detail. In August, Pauline told him she was expecting a child. She told him on a morning when she had come in from the garden and was washing her hands at the basin by the window, and she said it matter-of-factly, the way she said things that mattered most, and then she turned and looked at him with an expression that was carefully composed and very slightly terrified. "Are you?" she started. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands and said, "I am more glad than I can say." She let out a breath. "I wanted to be sure before I told you. I wanted to be certain." "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Reasonably well," she said. "Tired sometimes. The heat is harder than usual." She paused, a little frightened. "That's reasonable," he said. "I've seen how difficult." She stopped. In this territory, the dangers of childbirth were not abstract. They were close and real, and women talked about them in the direct way of people who had no luxury of pretending. "We'll go into Tucson," he said. "There's a doctor there, and I know Gideon's wife Clara has experience with births. We'll make arrangements well ahead and we'll go to town when the time is close." "You've thought about this," she said. "I've thought about everything that concerns you," he said. "That is more or less my permanent occupation." She looked at him with an expression that was between exasperation and deep affection, which was a combination she had perfected over the months of their marriage. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "Both of you." She looked down at her hands and then back up at him, and her face was soft and open and radiant with something he had no word for except that it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They made the arrangements as he had said. Clara Marsh was enthusiastic and helpful, already treating Pauline with the affectionate bossy concern of an honorary aunt. The doctor in Tucson was seen and approved of and their arrangements made. The work on the homestead was adjusted for Pauline's comfort as the summer progressed, though Pauline resisted most adjustments and Vernon had to negotiate each one with the care of a diplomat. "You could let me carry the heavier water," he said one afternoon. "I'm not incapacitated, Vernon, I'm expecting a child. Women have managed this since time began," she said. "They have," he agreed. "And some of them also accepted help when it was offered and were fine." A pause. "Fine," she said. "You can carry the heavy water." He did not let the satisfaction show. The fall came and with it the harvest, which was the best they had seen, the grain fields producing abundantly, the garden having had a long productive season, the herd healthy and increased. They put up stores that were genuinely sufficient, not just barely adequate but properly substantial, enough to carry through winter with ease, and the sense of security that came from it was something Vernon had not known before, not just survival sufficiency but actual abundance. Pauline had written to her brother Robert in St. Louis about the baby, and Robert had written back a long letter that began with the usual concerns about frontier life and ended with genuine congratulations and a gift of money that was more than they needed but meant in kindness. Pauline had read the letter and said, "He's coming around," which was all she said about it, but she filed the letter with the others. The baby came in January of 1884, right on schedule, in Tucson at a boarding house they had arranged, with Clara Marsh and the doctor both present and Vernon outside the door for what felt like the entire length of time that the world had existed, until the door opened and Clara looked out at him with her eyes full of tears and said, "A boy, Vernon. A healthy, fine boy." He went in and Pauline was there, tired as he had ever seen her, tired in every cell, but with an expression on her face that was entirely new and entirely beyond anything he had seen before, looking down at the bundled small person in her arms with the complete absorption of a person encountering something that rearranges everything. She looked up at him when he came to the bedside, and her eyes were full. "Come here," she said softly. "Come see him." He sat beside her and looked at his son, red-faced and perfect and impossibly small, sleeping with the focused intensity of the newly arrived. "He looks like a person," Vernon said, which was not what he meant but was the truest thing he had immediate access to. Pauline laughed, softly so as not to wake the baby, and leaned her head against Vernon's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, careful of her exhaustion. "What shall we name him?" she said. "You decide," he said. "You did the harder work here." She looked at the baby for a long moment. "Thomas," she said, "for his father's friend who built this home and this land. And James for your father." He had told her about his father, James Redmond, a quiet farmer from Missouri who had died when Vernon was 22 and who he still thought about with a particular ache. He had not expected her to remember. "Thomas James Redmond," he said. "Is that all right?" she asked. "It is better than all right," he said. They stayed in Tucson for 2 weeks, which the doctor recommended, and then they went home to the homestead, Pauline riding the gentler route and Vernon driving a small wagon with the baby's basket secured in the back. And when the house came into view, Pauline made a small sound and said, "There it is," and Vernon understood everything she meant. Home. Theirs. Built from difficult ground and determination, and a kind of love that had grown up alongside all the other things. They had grown patient and practical and rooted. The years after that settled into the particular rhythm of a life that was full and real. Thomas grew from the red-faced bundle into a toddler who regarded the cattle with suspicious interest and the mule with profound suspicion, which the mule frankly deserved. Vernon built a proper addition to the house, 2 rooms, properly fitted, so that the child had his own space, and they had the room that the expansion of their life required. The property expanded, not dramatically but steadily, in the careful way of people who understood the land and respected its limits. The North Field became a regular grain operation. The herd grew to a size that required a hired hand for several months each year during the intensive seasons. And Vernon found a young man named Ezra who had come to the territory from Texas with good skills and a quiet, reliable character. And Ezra became a fixture of the busy seasons. Pauline continued to read and to think and to plan, and Vernon continued to build and tend and protect, and they continued to argue about things in the honest, practical way of two people who respected each other's opinions and knew when to hold their ground and when to give way. She was right more often than he initially expected, and he was right often enough to maintain his dignity, and the balance between them was good. In 1886, Pauline told him there was to be a second child, and this time she told him with less terror and more calm, though the fear never entirely went away. They both knew what they were risking and chose to face it honestly. The second child was a girl, born in late spring of 1886, and she arrived in the world with a vocal clarity that announced itself immediately and at considerable volume. They named her Margaret, for Pauline's mother who had died when Pauline was 12, a loss she carried quietly but permanently. Thomas was 2.5 when Margaret arrived, and he received her with the resigned fascination of a person who has not been consulted about a major change to their circumstances and is not entirely sure how they feel about it. Within a month, he had decided she was acceptable. Within a year, they were inseparable in the way of siblings who fight constantly and would defend each other without hesitation. Vernon watched his children grow on this land with a feeling he had no adequate vocabulary for something vast and specific and tender, a love that was different from what he felt for Pauline, but not less important, a love that seemed to confirm in daily evidence the right of everything he had chosen. He thought about the day in 1882 when Gideon had slid a piece of paper across a table with an address on it, and said there was a woman struggling alone in the desert, and would Vernon go? He thought about the choice he had made without knowing what he was choosing, riding south in the early morning with supplies and no particular expectations. He thought about Pauline standing on that porch with the flower on her cheek and her 2 large boots and her eyes that were exactly halfway between relief and wariness, and the complicated thing that had happened in his chest that he had not immediately understood. He understood it now. In the summer of 1887, Gideon Marsh came to visit, as he did every few months, and sat on the porch of the expanded house and watched Thomas and Margaret run through the garden in the late afternoon with the energetic purposelessness of children everywhere, and he drank his coffee and said nothing for a while. Thomas Sullivan would have liked this, he finally said. He wanted the land to have life on it. He always said that to me. He said land without life is just ground. Pauline, sitting beside Vernon on the porch, said, he told me that too. She paused. I try to honor what he built, what we built together. You've done more than honor it, Gideon said. You've made it something new. Vernon looked at the house and the garden and the healthy herd in the far pasture, and his son running across the yard hollering at his sister and his wife beside him, warm and solid and familiar and endlessly interesting. Yes, he said, we have. There was a question that people occasionally asked, people who knew the story of how Vernon had come to be here, strangers sometimes, or newer neighbors, people who heard the story secondhand and were curious about the mechanics of it. How does a man end up somewhere? How does a choice like that get made? Vernon's answer was always the same, and it was always true. Someone had given him an address and told him a woman was struggling, and he had gone because it was the right thing to do, and because he had nothing more pressing, and because he trusted Gideon's judgment. Those were the practical reasons. The real reason was that he had gone because something in him had moved toward this place before he knew what it was, the way water finds its level without being told where down is. He had arrived before she had finished struggling, which was the fact of it. She was still in the hard middle of it when he rode in, still carrying more than any person was built to carry alone. He had helped. That was the work. And then he had stayed. That was the rest of it, the longer and more permanent thing, the part that could not have been planned or predicted on the morning he left Gideon's ranch with a bedroll and a horse and an address. He had stayed because staying was what made sense. Because the work was not finished, and then because the work became a life, and the life had a woman in it who was unlike anyone he had encountered, and then the life had children and land, and a future with dimension and weight and meaning. He had stayed because leaving had become unimaginable. That was love, as far as Vernon Redmond understood it. Not a feeling that arrived whole and explained itself, but a series of days and decisions that accumulated into something indistinguishable from yourself. Not something you found, but something you built, the way you built everything else worth having, with consistent effort and good materials and the willingness to keep working even when the work was hard. He thought Pauline understood it the same way. They had never had the conversation in those terms exactly, but they had had 1,000 other conversations that amounted to the same thing, practical and honest, and conducted between two people who had agreed, without quite saying so, to be truthful with each other above almost everything else. On a September evening in 1887, Thomas was 3 years old and Margaret was 16 months, and the harvest was coming in well, and the evening light was the particular gold that this time of year produced, slanting long across the desert and making every ordinary thing extraordinary for about an hour. They were on the porch, which was the place they always ended up when the day allowed it, and the children were inside with their evening business, and the herd was settled and the land was doing its peaceful best work. Pauline had her book open but was not reading it, just holding it, looking at the evening. "I've been thinking," she said. He said. "About everything," she said. "About where I was 5 years ago this time of year. The irrigation had just failed and I was carrying water from the well and the cattle were sick and I had no idea what was going to happen." She paused. "And then you appeared." "I appeared," he said with a slight smile. "Before I had finished being in trouble," she said. "I think about that. Most people wait until you've solved your own problems and then they offer to help with the aftermath. You came while I was still in the middle of it." "That was the point," he said. "After is too late." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "it was." She looked back at the evening. "And then you stayed. That was what mattered most. Not just coming, but staying." "I wanted to," he said simply. "I know," she said. "That was the part I couldn't quite believe at first. People come and go on the frontier. Everyone passes through. The idea that someone would choose to stop." She stopped, started again. "I'm grateful every day, Vernon. I want you to know that. Not just for what you did in the beginning, but for every day after, for being here." He reached over and took her hand. Her fingers closed around his with the easy familiarity of 5 years of this, and they sat in the evening light while it turned from gold to amber to the soft blue-gray that preceded dark. "Thank you for letting me," he said. "For trusting me when you had good reason not to trust, for letting a stranger into your home." "You were a good stranger," she said. "You were a good judge of character," he said. She laughed, the full and real laugh, and then Margaret's voice rose inside the house in the particular pitch that indicated she had found something she wanted and was not receiving it promptly enough, and Pauline got up with the book under her arm and said, "I'll go," and went inside. Vernon sat in the cooling dark a while longer, listening to the quiet sounds of his house and his land. Reed moved in the stable. The cattle made their low evening sounds. Inside, Pauline's voice was calm and capable as she managed whatever small domestic crisis had arisen, and Thomas's voice chimed in with the particular 3-year-old certainty about everything, and Margaret's complaint subsided into the uncomplicated happiness of a child whose world is adequate. Vernon Redmond sat on the porch of the home he had built with the woman he loved on the land they had made into something worth passing on, and the Arizona territory spread out before him in every direction, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the stars appeared one by one as they always had and always would. He had been given an address once and told a woman was struggling. He had been there before she finished struggling. He had stayed every day after. It turned out that was the full length of a life. In the spring of 1889, the territory was full of talk about statehood, which would eventually come for Arizona but had not yet. And in the meantime, the land continued to be governed by its own laws, the laws of weather and water and work, which were older than any legislature and considerably more reliable. Vernon had been thinking about whether to expand the operation further, whether there was wisdom in acquiring the small adjacent parcel that had come up for sale, and he and Pauline had been discussing it for several weeks in the careful, deliberate way they discussed everything that mattered. The parcel was to the east, abutting their current boundary, and it had a secondary water source that would give them considerably more flexibility during dry seasons. The price was fair and the land was good, and there was nothing wrong with the idea except that it was larger than they had ever gone before. "We can afford it," Pauline said one morning over breakfast. She had been doing the accounts the night before and had the numbers in her head the way she always did. "If we are careful this year and hold back the expansion of the herd until the following spring, we can buy the parcel outright." "That's what you want to do," he said. "I think it's the right move," she said. "Thomas always said the water source to the east was the real value in that parcel. He considered buying it himself twice, and both times something else came up." She met Vernon's eyes. "I'd like to finish something he started," Vernon nodded. "Then we buy it," Pauline smiled. "Good, I'll write to the owner this week." Thomas, now 5 years old and possessing very strong opinions about most things, looked up from his breakfast and said, "What are we buying?" "Land," Vernon said. "More land," Pauline clarified. Thomas considered this with the serious expression he applied to important questions. "Good," he said finally, with the authority of a child who has decided something, and went back to his breakfast. Vernon and Pauline exchanged a look over his head, and the look contained everything: amusement and affection, and the particular pleasure of people who have made a family together, and are every day astonished by it. The parcel was purchased in the summer of 1889, and the fence line was moved, and the water source was properly developed over the course of that fall. And by winter, the new land was incorporated into the operation as naturally as if it had always been theirs. Robert, Pauline's brother in St. Louis, finally made the journey west in November of 1889, having talked about it for years and always found a reason to delay. He arrived by train to Tucson, and Vernon went to meet him at the station, and Robert turned out to be a compact, precise man in his 30s who looked at Vernon with the appraising gaze of an older brother, performing his belated assessment of the man his sister had chosen. Vernon let himself be assessed. He had some sympathy for the position Robert was in, a man who had watched his sister move far away into a life he could not fully understand, who had worried and sent money and written letters and now was finally here. "She writes about you in every letter," Robert said on the ride from Tucson. "Has for years." "Good things, I hope," Vernon said. Robert looked sideways at him. "Mostly," he said, and there was a dry humor in it that told Vernon the man was not unreasonable. "She says you're steady. That was the word she used most, steady." "I try to be," Vernon said. When they arrived at the homestead and Pauline came out onto the porch with Margaret on her hip and Thomas running ahead of her, and when Robert saw his sister, healthy and strong and rooted in this place in every way it was possible to be rooted, his face changed. The worry that had lived there came loose and fell away, and what replaced it was something simpler and better. He stayed for 2 weeks. He helped with the work, badly at first and better as the days went on. He watched Vernon with his sister and watched the family they had made, and on his last evening, sitting on the porch after supper in the tradition that went back to the very beginning, he said to Vernon, "I was wrong to worry. I can see that now." "You were right to worry," Vernon said. "This is a hard place. She's done remarkably well, but it was genuinely difficult." "Yes," Robert said, "but she has done remarkably well." He paused. "And you have a part in that." "She has the larger part," Vernon said. I just came when she needed someone to come." Robert looked at him steadily. "That is, in my experience," he said, "underrated." The night was clear and cold and full of stars, and inside the house Pauline was reading to the children, her voice carrying through the walls with the cadence of the story she was telling. And Vernon and Robert sat in the cold, companionable quiet of two men who had arrived at an understanding. By 1890, the Sullivan Redmond homestead was a functioning and prosperous operation in the Arizona Territory. Not wealthy in the way that wealthy men in eastern cities were wealthy, but genuinely sound, food sufficient, animals healthy, land cared for, debts none. Vernon was 36 and Pauline 34, which was old enough to have lost the rawness of early adulthood and young enough to have decades still ahead. Thomas was 6 and had his mother's dark eyes and his father's quietness, and a stubborn streak that seemed to belong entirely to himself. Margaret was 4 and had decided somewhere around her 3rd birthday that she was in charge of most things and was conducting herself accordingly, with a confidence that occasionally terrified the adults responsible for her and more often delighted them. Gideon Marsh retired from active cattle ranching that year, and he and Clara moved into Tucson proper, and on the day they came to say goodbye in a formal way, the ranch sold to a younger man. The chapter closed. Gideon stood on the porch of the house with his hat in his hands and looked at the homestead and then at Vernon and Pauline standing side by side in the doorway, and he said, "This is exactly what I hoped for." "You knew," Pauline said. "I hoped," he said. "I knew Vernon was a good man. I knew you were a remarkable woman. I thought there was a possibility." He smiled, which on Gideon's face was a rare and particular thing. "I'm glad I was right." Pauline stepped forward and hugged him, which surprised the old man visibly and moved him considerably, and Clara wept in the thorough and cheerful way she always wept at happy things. That evening, after they had gone, Pauline and Vernon sat on the porch in the October cooling and were quiet for a while, with the comfortable quiet of people who have everything they need to say already said and are now simply sitting in the fullness of it. "Gideon hoped for us," Pauline said. "I know," Vernon said. "I think Thomas might have hoped for something like it too," she said. "Not exactly this, but someone to be here." "He would be glad of it, I think," Vernon said. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "I think he would." The night came down on the territory with its usual magnificent indifference and its stars without count, and the house behind them was warm and full of the sounds of their children settling into sleep, and the land before them stretched to the dark mountains and beyond, all the way to a horizon they would never reach, but that was theirs to look at every evening for as long as they lived here, which would be all their lives, which was exactly what they wanted. Vernon Redmond had been given an address on a piece of paper by a man who trusted him, and had been told that a woman was struggling in the desert and needed someone to come. He had gone because that was the kind of man he was. He had arrived before she had finished struggling, which was the whole point, not to come after the emergency was resolved, but to come in the middle of it and make the middle shorter and the after possible. And then he had stayed, because staying was what love was. Not a single moment of declaration, but every ordinary morning and every evening on the porch, and every shared meal, and every fence mended, and every child tended, and every year built on top of the year before. He had stayed, and the staying had made everything. Pauline Sullivan, Pauline Redmond now, though she sometimes used Sullivan in connection with the property, which had its history and its name, had received a stranger and made room for him, first in the work and then in the home, and then in the full and permanent interior of herself. She had done so carefully and honestly and in her own time, and every day she made the same choice again in the way that choices become part of the structure of who you are. They had built this, the two of them, out of hard ground and hard weather, and the specific luck of being sent to the same place at the same time, and having the good sense to recognize what was in front of them. The territory would eventually become a state. The frontier would eventually become something else, something more settled, with more people and more law and less of the wide-open, brutal beauty that had defined it. Things would change, as things always did, and Vernon and Pauline Redmond would change with them, growing older and grayer and more fixed in the particular ways that came with deep belonging to a place and a life. But tonight was 1890, and they were 36 and 34, and the land was theirs, and the children were asleep, and the stars were out in all their abundance, and the coffee was warm, and they were sitting together on the porch of the house they had made into a home, and there was nowhere else in the whole of the world that either of them wanted to be. That was the story, simple and complete. A man had been given an address. He had come. He had stayed. And it had been enough for everything.